what if the exact velocity at which you sit down in your chair right now could accurately predict your risk of losing your mobility a decade from now?
It's a wild thought, right?
It really is. I mean, for most of modern medical history, we've measured human physical decline in these, macro events, a sudden fall, a noticeable limp, or just suddenly not being able to climb a flight of stairs.
Yeah, the obvious stuff.
Right. But the microscopic precursors to those events happen years before the naked eye can ever detect them. So for you listening today, our mission is to explore one of the most objective, granular markers of human aging and functional decline ever quantified.
It's a fascinating topic.
Definitely. And we are pulling the data for this deep dive from a highly rigorous research article. I have it right here. It's titled, "Can Changes in Sit-to-Stand Performance Throughout a 30S Time Interval Be Used as a Marker of Performance Fatigability in Middle-Aged to Older Adults?"
That is a mouthful of a title, but it is so precise.
Yeah, academics love their long titles. This was authored by Max Riesbeck, Antti Löppönen, Jolien Deboutte, Christophe Delecluse, Lotta Palmberg, and Evelien van Roie. And it was published in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine on June 1st, 2026. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the simple act of standing up from a chair is, well, it's something we do dozens of times a day without thinking.
Exactly. The premise of this paper is deceptive in its simplicity. I mean, standing up from a chair is the absolute baseline of human locomotion. It requires lower limb strength, balance, core stability, all of that.
Yeah.
But by putting the 30-second sit-to-stand test under a biomechanical microscope, the researchers aren't just looking at whether someone can complete the task. They are hunting for this concept called performance fatigability. And that provides a critical window into the underlying neurophysiology of aging.
Let's isolate that term immediately.
Yeah.
Because performance fatigability in a clinical context is not what most people mean when they say they feel tired after a workout.
No, not at all. Subjective fatigue is totally different.
Right. Subjective fatigue is just a psychological construct. It's your brain calculating your perceived exertion, like, oh, I'm out of breath. But performance fatigability is a strictly objective, exercise-induced decline in absolute physical force or power output. It happens regardless of how the subject actually feels.
Spot on. We are talking about a measurable deterioration, and it arises from two distinct pathways. First, you have the neural mechanisms. So that's the central nervous system's ability to maintain high-frequency action potentials and, recruit motor units.
Okay, so the brain-to-muscle connection.
Exactly. Then you have the muscular or peripheral mechanisms. This is the localized accumulation of metabolic byproducts like inorganic phosphate or hydrogen ions. And those physically interfere with the calcium binding in your muscle fibers.
Which literally stops the muscle from contracting as hard.
Yes. When either or both of those systems degrade during a continuous task, your physical power output just drops. And why this matters so much is that greater fatigability in these tests serves as an early warning diagnostic. It's linked to future mobility loss, physical inactivity, and even all-cause mortality in older adults.
Wow. Okay, so to stress test those neural and muscular pathways, the researchers utilized this 30-second sit-to-stand test. The parameters are pretty standard. It's a 0.46-meter armless chair. The participant has their arms crossed over their chest, which I assume is to eliminate momentum generation from the upper body.
Yeah, you can't use your arms to swing yourself up.
Right. And then they execute as many full extensions as possible in exactly 30 seconds. So to give this a technical framing, if perceived fatigue is like looking at your phone and thinking the battery icon looks low, performance fatigability is like running a heavy diagnostic app and measuring the exact millimeter drop in processing speed over 30 seconds.
I love that analogy, yes. And that framing actually highlights the historical flaw in how this test has been administered. For decades, clinicians have basically just used a stopwatch and counted the final number of completed repetitions.
Just a raw score, like you got 15 reps, good job.
Right. Recording 15 repetitions tells us the total work capacity, sure, but it obscures the rate of decay. Think about it. Two individuals might both complete 15 reps, but one could maintain a perfectly symmetrical power output throughout the whole 30 seconds.
A nice steady pace.
Exactly. While the other person might suffer a catastrophic drop in concentric force after just 10 seconds, and then they have to heavily alter their biomechanics just to survive the final 20 seconds and get to that same score of 15.
Ah, I see. And if the human visual system processes movement at roughly, 60 frames per second? A clinician sitting in a room with a clipboard simply cannot perceive a minor shift in a patient's center of gravity.
Not a chance.
Or like a slight deceleration in their concentric lift. The naked eye is just a terrible instrument for capturing early-stage neuromuscular decline.
It really is, which is why relying on direct visual observation or even older technological methods leaves massive blind spots.
Wait, counting reps has worked for decades, though. Why do we need to strap a sensor to someone's back just to watch them stand up? Isn't that overcomplicating a basic movement?
It sounds like it, but what's fascinating here is the sheer volume of hidden data we've been missing. Traditional tech, like linear encoders or force plates, only capture a fraction of the story. Linear encoders only track the vertical velocity of the torso via a tether. Force plates just measure the physical force exerted into the ground.
Okay, so they measure speed and push, basically.
Right, but both of those miss the internal kinematic adjustments the body makes when it starts to fail. To capture that, this study utilized a body-fixed inertial measurement unit, or IMU. It is a tiny triaxial sensor positioned tightly over the L4 and L5 vertebral level.
Right on the lower back. Because the L4-L5 junction represents the approximate center of mass for a human adult.
Right.
Right?
Exactly. By placing the IMU there, the researchers aren't just measuring the speed of the lift. The IMU's accelerometers and gyroscopes calculate absolute mean sit-to-stand power in watts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it continuously tracks trunk flexion. That's the exact angular degree to which the torso leans forward. Furthermore, the algorithms take this one continuous repetition and segment it into 4 distinct kinematic subphases.
Breaking it down piece by piece.
Yes, you have the sit-to-stand upward transition, the standing phase, and the stand-to-sit downward descent.
Okay, that segmentation is crucial because when your primary leg extensors, like the quadriceps and gluteus maximus, begin experiencing that peripheral fatigue we talked about,
Correct.
your central nervous system doesn't just give up and accept failure, right?
No, it is incredibly stubborn. It subconsciously alters your biomechanics to preserve task execution. It starts recruiting secondary muscle groups and manipulating your center of gravity.
Cheats.
Essentially, yes, it cheats to keep you moving. And the IMU operates at a high enough frequency to capture those microscopic structural cheats in 3-dimensional space, fraction of a second by fraction of a second.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The methodology isolated those precise cheats by comparing the kinematic data from the first 10 seconds of the 30-second test against the final 10 seconds.
The fresh phase versus the fatigued phase.
Right, and the sample size was really robust. They had 195 participants in total, divided into 93 middle-aged adults, that's between 55 and 64, and 102 older adults aged 65 and up. So, looking at the aggregate data across everyone, absolute mean power declined from the first 10 seconds to the last 10 seconds by an average of 11.9 watts.
Which is significant. A nearly 12-watt drop in absolute power over just a few seconds of continuous movement is a clear indicator that the localized metabolic environment in those leg extensors is degrading.
They're losing juice.
Exactly. The muscle fibers are physically losing their output capacity.
But, you know, a wattage drop is sort of expected when you get tired. The kinematic adaptation, the changing of the body's mechanics, is where the underlying neurobiology really reveals itself. The IMU data showed that by the final 10 seconds, trunk flexion increased by an average of 1.35 degrees, so the torso is leaning further forward.
Yes, the forward lean.
Is this increase in trunk flexion sort of like a cyclist leaning further over their handlebars when they hit a steep hill? Like, mechanically speaking, you're changing your body's mechanical leverage because the engine is struggling.
That is a perfect analogy. We are looking at a basic class 3 lever system here. When the engine loses power, the body alters the lever arm. By increasing trunk flexion, the participant shifts their center of mass anteriorly.
Moving the way forward.
Right. And that moves the load closer to the pivot point of the knee and hip joints, artificially reducing the required torque to achieve extension. The central nervous system is performing complex calculus in real time. Because the quadriceps can no longer generate the explosive upward force required to lift the mass against gravity, given the original lever length, the brain initiates that forward lean.
It's so smart.
It is. It is a highly effective subconscious compensatory strategy. You reduce the torque demand on the failing muscles, which allows you to continue the repetitions, but you are executing the movement with compromised biomechanical efficiency.
So you sacrifice structural integrity to maintain output. And that mechanical compromise bled into the timing, the temporal data as well.
Right.
By the end of the 30 seconds, the duration of the upward sit-to-stand phase increased significantly. The concentric movement slowed down as the fast-twitch motor units fatigued. But the duration of the downward stand-to-sit phase did the exact opposite.
Right.
It actually decreased. They dropped into the chair faster at the end of the test than at the beginning.
Yeah, the downward descent requires eccentric muscle contraction. So the muscle fibers are lengthening under tension to act as a braking mechanism against gravity.
Like letting down a heavy box slowly.
Exactly. And eccentric control requires intense neuromuscular discipline. Far fewer motor units are recruited during eccentric movements compared to concentric ones, meaning the active fibers bear a significantly higher mechanical load. As fatigue sets in, the ability to maintain that braking force diminishes rapidly.
Let me challenge that interpretation for just a moment, though. If the stand-to-sit duration is decreasing, meaning they are dropping into the chair faster, couldn't we just attribute that to gravity? Like, if the muscles are exhausted, the participant simply stops fighting the downward pull. Is that really a failure of eccentric control, or just physics taking over because the participant is prioritizing the remaining energy for the hard part, the upward lift?
That is a great question. It's actually a combination of both physiological failure and behavioral pacing, and distinguishing the two is essential. You are correct that gravity is the accelerating force. However, the inability to resist that force indicates that the cross-bridge cycling in the muscle fibers during eccentric lengthening is breaking down. The biological brakes are physiologically failing.
Okay, so the hardware is failing.
Yes. But simultaneously, as the authors note, the central nervous system may recognize that the concentric upward phase is taking longer. To maintain the overall repetition count, which is the primary goal of the test, the brain subconsciously rushes the easier, gravity-assisted downward phase to make up for lost time.
Oh, wow. So it's a behavioral compensation layered directly on top of a mechanical deficit.
Exactly. The body is constantly negotiating with itself to optimize performance under stress. We have clear, quantified markers of this negotiation: reduced wattage, increased anterior load shifting, delayed concentric execution, and accelerated eccentric descent.
It's a whole cascade of events. But applying these markers across the different demographic groups in the study resulted in a really fascinating divergence from traditional assumptions about aging and fatigue curves.
Yeah, this is where the data really surprised people. Most clinical models would hypothesize that the older cohort, those over 65, would exhibit a drastically steeper fatigue curve than the 55-year-olds.
Right. So going into this, I would have assumed that the older adults and maybe the different sexes would show massively different fatigue curves. Like, the older group's power would drop off a cliff in the final 10 seconds compared to the 35-year-olds, just because of age-related muscle loss. But looking at the data, that assumption flatlines. Why?
To understand it, we have to separate baseline capacity from the actual rate of fatigability. The baseline differences align perfectly with biological expectations. Older adults generated about 26 fewer watts of overall absolute power than the middle-aged adults right out of the gate.
Makes sense.
And females generated roughly 127 fewer watts than males and exhibited greater baseline trunk flexion from the very first repetition. That's likely due to general differences in lower limb muscle mass and natural biomechanical leverage.
Okay, so the initial engine size, the maximum power output, was dictated by age and sex.
Yes. However, the crucial finding of the study lies in the rate of change. The percentage drop in absolute power from the first 10 seconds to the final 10 seconds, the actual performance fatigability, was virtually identical across all demographics. Men, women, 55-year-olds, and 80-year-olds all experienced the same relative rate of decay.
Wait, really? A 75-year-old and a 55-year-old draining their respective physiological batteries at the exact same speed during an all-out 30-second effort. That seems entirely counterintuitive.
I know, it really does. The only statistical deviation was that older adults showed a slightly less pronounced decrease in their stand-to-sit duration. They didn't surrender to gravity quite as aggressively as the middle-aged group during the descent.
Huh. Which might suggest that older adults subconsciously prioritize stability and fall prevention over raw repetition speed as they get tired.
That's a very solid theory, but the core mystery remains, right? Why was the overall rate of fatigability identical? Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer lies in the specific characteristics of the participant cohort. These were not frail, institutionalized patients.
Right, they were healthy.
Very healthy. The researchers recruited highly functioning community-dwelling adults. The raw repetition data proves this out. Both the middle-aged and older groups averaged between 15.5 and 18 complete repetitions.
Wait, 18 reps? Referencing standard clinical normative values, hitting 18 repetitions in 30 seconds for someone over 65 isn't just adequate, it's exceptional.
It really is. It represents a highly preserved neuromuscular system.
So they were basically athletes for their age group.
Exactly the point. Because this cohort possessed such a high baseline of physical fitness, the researchers found that 63% of the middle-aged adults and 50% of the older adults demonstrated no or limited fatigability. Their total absolute power dropped by less than 5% across the entire test.
Wow. So for half of the older adult population in this study, executing maximum effort squats against their own body weight for 30 seconds barely registered as a stressor.
Barely moved the needle. The localized accumulation of metabolites simply didn't reach a threshold to significantly impair calcium binding, and central neural drive remained robust.
Which brings us to the profound clinical takeaway of the paper, I think. Because the 30-second sit-to-stand test is a staple of geriatric assessment, primarily because it's quick and non-invasive. But for a well-functioning, healthy, older adult population, a 30-second protocol is fundamentally insufficient, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It does not exert enough sustained physiological stress to force the neuromuscular system into clinically meaningful fatigue. To accurately assess the latent rate of decay in a healthy individual, the parameters of the test must evolve.
So what do? Just make the test longer.
That's exactly what the researchers propose. To truly break through that high fitness threshold and measure performance fatigability, clinicians need to implement longer sustained protocols. Perhaps a 60-second or even a 90-second continuous test.
90 seconds of sit-to-stand sounds brutal.
It would be. Alternatively, they suggest utilizing high-intensity interval formats, demanding multiple 30-second bouts of maximum effort separated by minimal rest periods, intentionally driving the muscle fibers into a state of metabolic crisis to reveal the true degradation curve.
Because right now, the technology of the IMU has outpaced the protocol.
Precisely. We now possess the capability to measure kinematic shifts down to the millimeter and millisecond, but we are applying it to a test designed for a bygone era of clipboard observation. If we want to identify the invisible precursors to mobility loss in healthy adults, we have to push the system hard enough to induce the microscopic failures the IMU is designed to catch.
So what does this all mean? It opens up an entirely new paradigm for how we approach aging. The paper by Riesbeck, Löppönen, Deboutte, Delecluse, Palmberg, and Van Roie proves that these physiological compensations, the forward lean, the rapid eccentric descent, the loss of wattage, are quantifiable facts.
Yes, they are measurable realities.
Right. It proves that the human nervous system is engaged in this constant dynamic negotiation to preserve function in the face of localized failure. But looking beyond the laboratory setting of this specific study, the implications of capturing this kinematic data are staggering.
Think about the proliferation of microtechnology. This study required an IMU affixed to the L5 vertebra to capture triaxial acceleration and spatial orientation. But the accelerometers and gyroscopes embedded in modern smartwatches and mobile devices are becoming sophisticated enough to process similar data sets.
Like having an IMU in your pocket.
Exactly. We are rapidly approaching an inflection point where continuous passive monitoring of human movement replaces episodic laboratory testing.
A future where a wearable device tracks the kinematic profile of every single time you stand up from your desk, your couch, or your car. It just runs the diagnostic algorithms constantly in the background.
Imagine that. If, over a 6-month period, the device detects that your trunk flexion during a routine sit-to-stand movement has increased by 4 degrees, and your eccentric descent velocity has accelerated by 15%.
It flags a degradation in your lower limb torque and neuromuscular braking capacity.
Exactly. It would identify the onset of functional decline and an elevated fall risk years before the individual ever consciously experiences subjective fatigue or redness. It transitions geriatric care and sports science from a reactive model, treating the injury after the fall, to a purely predictive and preventative model.
That is incredible. Interventions, whether targeted resistance training to increase concentric power or specific eccentric loading protocols to restore that neuromuscular braking, could be implemented before the structural damage even manifests.
It completely redefines the timeline of aging. It moves the intervention window from the macro failure back to the microcompensation.
Well, for anyone who wants to dive deeper into the raw data, analyze the scatter plots of the power outputs, or review the specific mathematical algorithms used to process the triaxial IMU data, reading the original source material is highly recommended. Again, the article is, Can changes in sit-to-stand performance throughout a 30S time interval be used as a marker of performance fatigability in middle-aged to older adults? Published in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine.
Honestly, the methodology section alone is a masterclass in separating objective biomechanical reality from subjective clinical observation. It's well worth the read.
Absolutely. And for you listening, make sure you follow the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upcoming deep dive into similarly paradigm-shifting scientific literature. We are continually parsing the research to bring these complex mechanisms to light. Until next time, pay attention to the physics of your own movement today. You might just sense the invisible compensations your central nervous system is calculating in the background.